Next time you go digging through trash looking for clothes, look for food too, because we're cutting your salary.
The first thing I remember from that morning wasn't the insult. It was the silence that followed it. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, heavy and humiliating, when everyone hears the same thing and collectively decides not to react. Chairs stopped creaking. Keyboards froze mid-click. Even the air conditioner seemed to hesitate, as if it too was unsure whether it was allowed to keep working after what had just been said. I was standing by the printer, holding a stack of financial reports that were still warm from the machine. My name was on every page, not in print, of course, but in the hours behind them. In the nights spent fixing errors that weren't mine. In the weekends, no one knew I worked. In the calculations that had quietly kept the company from collapsing months earlier. Jason Miller leaned against the glass wall of the conference room, coffee in hand, perfectly relaxed. He didn't even look at me when he spoke. He didn't have to. His voice carried easily across the open office. "Next time you go digging through trash for clothes," he said with a lazy smirk, "look for food too. We're cutting your salary. The company is on the edge of bankruptcy." Someone let out a nervous cough. Someone else looked down at their screen a little too intently. No one laughed. Not because it wasn't funny, but because it was safer not to react at all. I felt my fingers tighten around the papers. I didn't look at him. Not yet. People later asked me what I felt in that moment. Anger? Shame? Rage? The truth is simpler. And worse. I felt exposed. Not because his words were true. They weren't. My clothes were old but clean. My salary was modest but earned. What stripped me bare was the certainty that he knew he could say it. Loudly. Publicly. Without consequences. Because he was the boss's son. And I was just Emily. I lowered my eyes. That's the part everyone remembers. The quiet girl looking down, absorbing the humiliation. Some thought I was weak. Others thought I was used to it. Jason himself probably thought he had won something. Another small victory in his daily routine of dominance. But that wasn't why I looked down. I looked down because I was counting. Not money. Time. I had learned, long before that morning, that reacting too early only feeds people like him. Jason thrived on reactions, on flushed faces and trembling voices, on apologies that were never enough. He needed an audience, and the office had become his favorite stage. So I stayed silent. I walked back to my desk slowly, aware of every step, every pair of eyes that followed me, and then quickly looked away. My chair felt colder than usual when I sat down. I placed the reports neatly in a folder, aligned it with the edge of my desk, and opened my laptop as if nothing had happened. My inbox was full. Unpaid invoices, panicked messages from middle managers, a warning from accounting about another missed payment deadline. Numbers blinking red where they should have been black. Bankruptcy. Jason liked that word. He used it often, usually when he wanted to justify cuts or blame someone else for his mistakes. It sounded dramatic, final, powerful. But the numbers told a different story. The company wasn't dying. It was bleeding. And I knew exactly where the wounds were. I had found them months ago, quietly, while Jason was busy leading meetings about vision and brand identity. I had patched some leaks without telling anyone, moved numbers just enough to keep us afloat, postponed disasters that would have exploded if exposed too early. No one thanked me. No one even noticed. Which, at the time, felt like a failure. That morning, for the first time, I understood it was an advantage. Jason passed by my desk later, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne. He slowed, just a little. "You heard me, right?" he said softly, so only I could hear. "Don't take it personally, it's just business." I looked up then. Not with defiance, not with tears. Just long enough to meet his eyes and let him see that I was listening, that I remembered every word. Of course, I replied quietly. He smiled, satisfied, and walked away. What he didn't see, what no one in that office saw, was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically, not like in movies. There was no internal monologue about revenge, no sudden surge of confidence, just a calm, cold decision settling into place. I stopped trying to survive. I started preparing. At that desk, under flickering fluorescent lights, with a salary they thought they could cut and a silence they mistook for submission, I made myself a promise. I would never forget that sentence. And one day, not soon, not loudly, it would cost them everything. My name is Emily Carter. For most people in that office, it was just a name attached to a desk in the far corner, near the window that didn't open properly, and the printer that jammed every other day. I wasn't invited to after-work drinks. I wasn't tagged in jokes in the group chat. When someone needed help urgently, they would message me privately, and then forget to mention my name in meetings. I became invisible by being useful. I arrived earlier than anyone else. The office lights were still dim when I hung my coat, the cleaning crew just finishing their rounds. I liked those quiet minutes before the noise began, before Jason's voice filled the space, before the company pretended everything was fine. I worked more than anyone. That wasn't arrogance. It was math. While others left at 6, I stayed until 9. While Jason talked about strategy, I rebuilt spreadsheets from scratch. While managers argued about whose fault something was, I fixed it before it reached the client. And I spoke less than anyone. Not because I had nothing to say, because I learned early that when a woman like me speaks too much, she becomes a problem. Jason Miller noticed everything about me, except my work. He noticed my shoes first. Too plain. My sweaters. Too old. My posture. Too straight. Apparently, tense. Even the way I drank coffee annoyed him. "You know you don't have to look so serious all the time," he once said loudly, leaning on my desk. "This isn't a library." I smiled politely and returned to my screen. Another time he glanced at my notes during a meeting and laughed. "Emily, you write everything down like it's school. Relax. You're not getting graded." Everyone laughed softly. I didn't. Those notes later saved the company from a lawsuit. No one mentioned that part. Jason liked to remind people, subtly, constantly, who he was. His last name opened doors. His confidence filled rooms. His mistakes disappeared into silence. And his father, Robert Miller, allowed it all. Robert was rarely cruel. That made it worse. He nodded. He avoided conflict. He trusted his son's instincts without checking the numbers. When Jason interrupted me in meetings, which he did every time I tried to speak, Robert never stopped him. So I stopped trying. Instead, I listened. I listened to what Jason promised clients and what he actually delivered. I listened to the excuses managers whispered in hallways. I listened to the numbers, the only thing that never lied. At night, when the office was empty again, I opened files no one asked me to touch. I traced debts back to their origins, found projects that were bleeding money because Jason wanted to look big, contracts signed without proper analysis, discounts given to impress people who never stayed. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. The company wasn't failing because of bad luck. It was failing because of ego. Sometimes, alone at my desk, I wondered why I kept going, why I didn't quit. I had enough experience to leave, enough skills to start over somewhere else. But there was something unfinished here, something unfair. I remembered my first week at the company, how proud I was to be hired, how Robert shook my hand and said, "We value loyalty here." How I believed him. Loyalty, I learned, was expected, not returned. Jason passed my desk dozens of times a day. He rarely used my name. It was always "hey" or "you," as if learning it required effort he didn't want to spend. Yet he trusted my work blindly. That was the irony. He mocked me publicly, but he relied on me privately. When something went wrong late at night, his assistant messaged me. When numbers didn't align before a presentation, my inbox filled with urgent requests. I always delivered. And every time I did, Jason stood a little taller, convinced the success was his. The quiet girl in the corner. That's what they saw. What they didn't see was the patience, the memory, the growing file on my hard drive labeled simply, facts. I didn't know yet how or when I would use it. I only knew one thing with absolute certainty. My time hadn't come yet. Companies don't collapse all at once. They drown slowly. At first, it looks harmless. A delayed payment here, a temporary loan there. A client that doesn't renew, explained away as market conditions. A cost that grows quietly because no one wants to admit it was a bad idea. From the outside, Miller and Cohen still looked respectable. Glass walls, clean logo, confident presentations. Jason loved that part. He loved standing in front of screens filled with colorful charts speaking about growth, expansion, vision. But numbers don't care about vision. And the numbers were screaming. I saw it late one evening when I stayed after everyone had left. The city outside the window was already dark, lights flickering like distant signals. I had no intention of digging deep that night. I just wanted to finish a routine report and go home. Instead, I found a pattern. Invoices that didn't match contracts. Budgets approved without projections. Marketing expenses triple what they should have been, all tied to projects Jason personally championed. At first, I assumed there was an explanation. There always is, when you want there to be one. I checked again, and again. Cross-referenced dates, emails, approvals. The explanation never came. The deeper I went, the worse it looked. Jason had negotiated discounts that sounded impressive in meetings but destroyed margins. He pushed for partnerships with flashy startups that never delivered. He signed off on expansions before the company could afford them, confident that growth would cover the losses. Growth never came. Debt did. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, feeling something tighten in my chest. Not panic. Clarity. This wasn't mismanagement. It was recklessness. And everyone paid for it except him. The next morning, I watched Jason walk in late, laughing on his phone, expensive coat draped over his arm. He joked with people, slapped shoulders, poured himself coffee without looking at the price of anything. I wondered how someone could be so careless with other people's livelihoods. Robert Miller arrived shortly after. Older, slower, eyes tired. He nodded at me politely, the way you nod at furniture you recognize, but never really see. He trusted reports Jason summarized for him. He trusted meetings Jason controlled. He trusted his son. That trust was costing the company millions. I started tracking everything. Not dramatically, not officially, quietly. I created parallel spreadsheets. One reflected the reality. Real cash flow, real losses, real risk. The other was what Jason presented. Softened numbers, delayed problems, optimism stretched thin. Every night, I reconciled the difference. I discovered that if just 3 of Jason's projects collapsed at the same time, the company wouldn't survive 6 months. Payroll would be at risk, credit lines would be frozen, vendors would walk away. Bankruptcy wasn't imminent. It was scheduled. And still, no one wanted to hear it. Once, during a meeting, I tried to raise a concern. I didn't accuse. I didn't name names. I simply pointed out a discrepancy. Jason cut me off before I finished my sentence. "We've been over this," he said, smiling like he was talking to a child. "You're focusing too much on details. Look at the bigger picture." Robert nodded. Meeting over. After that, I stopped speaking in meetings altogether. Instead, I worked. I renegotiated payment schedules without telling Jason, closed gaps by reallocating budgets he never checked. I delayed disasters, quietly, invisibly, knowing that if I didn't, people would lose jobs long before the truth surfaced. Sometimes I asked myself why I was doing it. Why save a company that humiliated me? Why protect a leadership that would never protect me? The answer was uncomfortable, because if it collapsed too soon, Jason would blame someone else, someone like me. I had seen it before. The quiet ones become convenient explanations, a bad analyst, a missed detail, a faceless employee who didn't speak up. I was not going to be that story, so I waited, and I watched. Jason announced another bold move at the next all-hands meeting, a risky deal, dressed up as opportunity. People applauded. Some because they believed him, others because applause was easier than doubt. I didn't clap. I went back to my desk, opened my private files, and added a new tab. Project risk, critical. That was the moment I understood something important. The company wasn't just drowning, it was being held underwater by the same hand that smiled for applause, and when it finally came time to surface the truth, it wouldn't be emotional. It would be precise. They always choose someone. When pressure builds, when numbers no longer obey optimism, when explanations are needed quickly, someone has to carry the weight. Someone replaceable. Someone quiet enough not to fight back. That morning, I knew it would be me. The email arrived before I even took my coat off. Mandatory meeting, salary adjustments, conference room B. No subject line ever sounded so polite while meaning something so ugly. People gathered slowly, pretending not to be nervous. Jason was already there, leaning back in his chair, fingers intertwined behind his head. Calm, confident, untouchable. His confidence was almost impressive, like someone standing dry on a dock while watching others struggle in rising water. Robert sat at the head of the table, hands folded, eyes tired. He looked older than usual. Jason started speaking before his father could. As you all know, he said, the market's been rough. We need to optimize costs. Tough decisions. His eyes drifted toward me, casually, deliberately. And some roles, he continued, are simply too expensive for the value they bring. The room went still. I felt it before my name was spoken. That strange sinking awareness when your turn has already been decided somewhere else. Emily, he said, finally using it. Your salary is generous. Given the situation, we'll have to reduce it. Reduce, as if it were a setting on a machine, as if my life could be adjusted without consequence. I waited. For facts, for data, for any explanation beyond his tone. None came. I do more than what's in my job description, I said carefully. My voice didn't shake. My performance reviews. Jason raised a hand. This isn't personal, he interrupted. It's business. That phrase again. I looked at Robert. For the first time in months, I really looked. He didn't meet my eyes. He nodded slowly, as if convincing himself this was necessary. As if silence were easier than conflict. In that moment, something hardened inside me. It wasn't anger yet. It was clarity. They didn't need proof. They needed permission. Jason was enjoying himself now. I could see it. The slight lift at the corner of his mouth. The way his voice grew louder, more confident. We all have to make sacrifices, he added. Some more than others. Sacrifices. I thought of the nights I stayed late fixing errors no one knew existed. The weekends spent preventing financial fires so meetings could look smooth. The personal plans canceled because the company needed me. This was the reward. I nodded once. Understood, I said. Jason seemed almost disappointed. He wanted resistance, emotion, tears maybe, something to confirm his power. I gave him nothing. The meeting ended quickly after that. People filed out, avoiding my eyes. No one said anything. Sympathy is dangerous in offices like this. It makes you visible. As I returned to my desk, Jason passed by me. "You should be grateful you still have a job," he said quietly. "Plenty of people would kill for it." I didn't reply, because something had shifted permanently. Until that moment, part of me still believed that hard work could protect me. That value would eventually be recognized. That loyalty mattered. That illusion died in conference room B. That evening, I didn't go straight home. I stayed. I opened my private folder. The one I had been building quietly, carefully. The one I never intended to use, until now. Emails approving reckless spending, reports altered for presentations, messages where Jason dismissed warnings and pushed forward anyway. I added a new document, timeline. Not emotional, not dramatic, just facts, dates, decisions, consequences. If they wanted a scapegoat, they chose the wrong one. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to complain. I wasn't going to warn them again. I was going to let them walk confidently toward their own reflection and finally see who had been pulling the company down all along. That night, as I shut down my computer, I realized something frightening and empowering at the same time. I was no longer afraid of losing this job, and that made me dangerous. Silence can be louder than protest. The day after my salary was cut, I didn't defend myself. I didn't ask questions. I didn't complain to HR or seek sympathy from coworkers. I arrived at the same time as always, placed my bag under the desk, turned on my computer, and started working. From the outside, nothing had changed. That unnerved Jason. He passed my desk twice that morning, pretending to look at his phone. The third time, he stopped. "You okay?" he asked, mock concern coding every syllable. "Of course," I replied without looking up. He waited for more. An explanation. A crack. When none came, he shrugged and walked away. What he didn't know was that my silence had become deliberate. Before, I stayed quiet to survive. Now, I stayed quiet to prepare. I stopped correcting Jason in meetings, not because he was right, but because letting him speak freely gave me something better than influence. It gave me evidence. He contradicted himself constantly, promised one thing to investors and another to the team. Approved expenses verbally, then denied responsibility later. He assumed his position protected him from memory. It didn't protect him from documentation. I saved everything. Not chaotically. Methodically. I created folders with neutral names. Finance. Operations. Client relations. Inside them, subfolders labeled by date. Inside those, files renamed carefully so they blended into the system. Nothing emotional. Nothing accusatory. Just truth. Archived patiently. At night, when the office emptied, I worked differently. I no longer fixed Jason's mistakes immediately. That was the hardest part. When I saw a bad decision forming, every instinct told me to intervene, to smooth it over, to prevent damage before it became visible. That's what I had always done. But now I asked myself one question before acting. If I fix this, who learns? The answer was always the same. No one. So I stopped shielding him completely. I still protected the company, but I let the cracks show just enough. Not enough to cause collapse. Enough to reveal patterns. Jason grew louder as pressure increased. He blamed departments openly, mocked caution, called concerns fear-based thinking. He started using my name again, but only as an example of what not to be. "Don't overanalyze like Emily," he joked in one meeting. "We need boldness, not spreadsheets." People laughed. I wrote it down. Robert remained distant. I noticed how rarely he checked reports now, how often he deferred to his son. Leadership fatigue, I realized, is dangerous. It creates blind trust, and blind trust always needs someone else to take the fall. My coworkers began to change toward me too. Some were kinder, quietly. A coffee left on my desk. A whispered, "I'm sorry," when Jason wasn't around. Others pulled away, afraid association might cost them. I didn't blame them. Fear is contagious in offices like this. The strangest part was how calm I felt. Not numb, focused. Every insult slid past me now, not because it didn't hurt, but because it had become predictable. Jason insulted to feel powerful. I observed to become prepared. I started mapping cause and effect. This decision led to this loss. This meeting created that risk. This email proved awareness and responsibility. Late one night, I opened a document titled Summary. I didn't fill it yet. I just looked at the empty page and imagined the moment it would no longer be empty. There was a kind of relief in knowing I wasn't invisible anymore. Not really. I was simply unseen. And unseen people can move freely. Jason, confident in my silence, began to slip. He forwarded emails without thinking. Put things in writing he used to say verbally. Delegated recklessly. Trusted that no one was watching closely. He was wrong. The silence before a storm feels peaceful if you don't know what's coming. I knew. And for the first time since that sentence at the printer, I wasn't waiting to be spared. I was waiting to strike. Quietly, cleanly, and only once. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, marked urgent, and sent to everyone from middle management upward. Northlake Industries, final negotiations. I froze for half a second when I saw the name. Northlake wasn't just another client, it was the client. A multinational contract that could stabilize our cash flow for years. The one deal that could erase half the debt Jason had created, or expose all of it at once. The room buzzed instantly. People whispered. Managers stood up, pacing. Someone said, "If we land this, we're saved." Jason walked out of his office like a general heading into battle. "This is it," he announced loudly. "Our turning point." He didn't look at me when he said it. Of course, he took control of the negotiations. He always did. This was his moment, the kind he lived for. Big names, big promises, big stage. I was assigned, unofficially, to support, prepare numbers, be available, stay quiet. Perfect. The first meeting with Northlake was a disaster, just not an obvious one. Jason dazzled them with confidence. He talked fast, smiled easily, promised flexibility, speed, expansion. He offered discounts that made the room nod approvingly. What he didn't do was ask the right questions. He didn't notice when the lead negotiator frowned slightly at the projections. He didn't pause when they asked about delivery capacity. He didn't calculate what those discounts actually meant for our margins. I did. By the end of the meeting, my notes were filled with red flags. Afterward, in the hallway, Jason was euphoric. "Did you see their faces?" He laughed. "They're hooked." I glanced at him. "We can't afford the terms you offered." His smile vanished for just a moment. "You worry too much," he snapped. "Let me handle this." He walked away before I could say more. I didn't chase him. Instead, I ran the numbers again. Slowly, carefully. If we accepted his terms as promised, we would lose money on every unit for the first 18 months. Cash flow would tighten. Credit lines would strain. One unexpected delay, and the company would be finished. This wasn't a growth opportunity. It was a slow suicide. The second meeting was worse. Northlake came prepared. They asked detailed questions. Jason improvised answers. He contradicted his own slides. At one point, he promised a delivery timeline that directly conflicted with our production capacity. I watched the room change. Interest turned into doubt. Doubt into calculation. This time, even Robert looked uneasy. When the meeting ended, the executives stayed behind, whispering urgently. Jason's confidence cracked. "We need to reassure them," he said sharply. "Emily, update the projections. Make them look cleaner, cleaner. There it was. The moment I had been waiting for without knowing it. I met his eyes. Calmly. "I won't falsify data," I said. The room went silent. Jason stared at me as if I had spoken in another language. "I didn't say falsify," he said slowly. "Just adjust." "They're already adjusted," I replied. "Any more, and the numbers won't hold." Robert looked at me then. Really looked. For the first time in years. "What happens if we sign this deal as is?" he asked. Jason opened his mouth. I spoke first. "We lose money," I said evenly. "Immediately. And if Northlake enforces the penalty clauses Jason agreed to verbally, we won't survive the year." Jason exploded. "That's speculation," he shouted. "You're undermining me in front of people who need the truth," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I opened my laptop and turned it toward the table. "Here are the real projections. Here's the impact of the discounts. Here's the risk exposure." Numbers filled the screen. Clear. Precise. Impossible to argue with. The room felt suffocating. No one spoke. Northlake's lead negotiator leaned forward slightly. "Why is this the first time we're seeing this version?" he asked. Jason couldn't answer. Robert swallowed. In that moment, everything shifted. The deal that was supposed to save Jason exposed him instead. Every promise, every shortcut, every reckless decision aligned into one undeniable picture. I closed my laptop. "Let me finish the negotiations," I said calmly. Jason laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "You?" he scoffed. "This is above your—" Robert raised his hand. "Let her speak," he said quietly. Jason turned to his father, stunned. And that was when I knew. The strike had begun. I stood at the head of the table, aware of every eye in the room, yet strangely detached from them. The fear I once imagined feeling in a moment like this never arrived. Instead, there was a steady clarity, as if everything I had seen, saved, and calculated had finally aligned into a single, unavoidable line. Northlake's executives waited, not impatiently, attentively. That alone told me everything. I didn't start with accusations. I didn't mention Jason's name. I didn't reference humiliation, salary cuts, or insults. None of that mattered here. Facts did. "I'll walk you through the real picture," I said. "Not the optimistic one, the accurate one." I clicked to the first slide. Cash flow, debt structure, operational capacity. Each number was sourced. Each assumption explained. I spoke slowly, not to simplify, but to make sure nothing could be misunderstood or dismissed later. Jason shifted in his chair. I could feel his irritation like static in the air. I continued. "These discounts," I said, highlighting a column, "reduce our margins below sustainability. This delivery timeline assumes resources we don't currently have, and these penalty clauses," I paused deliberately, "transfer all risk to us." Northlake's lead negotiator nodded slightly. Robert's face had gone pale. Jason leaned forward abruptly. "You're framing this in the worst possible way." I turned to him for the first time. "No," I said. "I'm framing it in the only way the numbers allow." The room was silent again, but this silence was different from the one at the printer weeks ago. This one was focused, sharp, listening. I moved on. "These decisions weren't isolated," I continued. "They form a pattern." I opened another document. A timeline appeared on the screen. Project names, dates, approvals, each linked to escalating losses. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't need to. The alignment spoke for itself. Northlake's legal advisor adjusted his glasses. "These projections, they contradict what we were told earlier." "Yes," I replied calmly. "Because earlier you were shown projections designed to secure agreement, not to sustain partnership." Jason stood up. "This is unbelievable," he snapped. "You're sabotaging the deal." I didn't look at him this time. I'm preventing a failure, I said. There's a difference. Robert finally spoke. Jason, he said quietly. Did you know about these risks? Jason opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. It's business, he said weakly. You take risks. Robert's shoulders sagged. Risk, I said gently, is calculated. This was concealed. That was the word that changed everything. Concealed. I clicked once more. Emails appeared on the screen. Jason's words, his approvals, his dismissals of warnings, his instructions to keep it high level and not complicate things. No commentary, just timestamps. The air in the room felt thick, like before a storm breaks. Northlake's lead negotiator leaned back. So, he said slowly, if we were to proceed, it would be under entirely different terms. Yes, I said, with transparency, real margins, real timelines. And under whose authority? He asked. Robert answered before I could. Hers. Jason turned to his father, disbelief written across his face. You can't be serious. Robert looked at him, truly looked, and something in his expression shifted. Pride drained away, replaced by something closer to regret. I should have been checking, Robert said quietly. I trusted you instead. Jason laughed, but there was panic in it now. You're choosing her over me? He demanded. I'm choosing the company, Robert replied. For a moment, no one moved. Then Northlake's negotiator stood. We'll need time to review this, he said. But I appreciate honesty. It's rare. They gathered their documents and left the room calmly, professionally, leaving chaos behind them. As the door closed, Jason exploded. This is your fault, he shouted at me. You planned this. You waited. I met his gaze evenly. Yes, I said. I did. Robert closed his eyes briefly. Jason, he said, leave the room. Jason stared at him, shocked. Now, Robert repeated. Jason slammed his chair back and stormed out, the sound echoing down the hallway. When the door shut, the room felt strangely empty. Robert looked at me. How long have you known? He asked. I didn't exaggerate. Long enough, I replied. He nodded slowly. I owe you an apology, he said, and the company owes you more than that. I felt something loosen inside my chest then, not triumph, not joy. Relief. For the first time, the truth had been spoken aloud, and once spoken, it could never be buried again. The decision didn't happen in a dramatic boardroom showdown. There was no applause, no speeches, no satisfying moment where justice announced itself loudly. It happened quietly, the way real endings often do. Jason didn't return to his office after that meeting. He paced the hallway for nearly an hour, voice raised on phone calls that went unanswered. I watched him through the glass wall as Aijung Lee read my files, the same way I had every day. Only now, the balance had shifted. He wasn't the one observing anymore. He was the one unraveling. Robert asked me to stay. We sat in his office long after most employees had left. The city lights outside had come on, reflections stretching across the glass like fractured lines. For the first time since I'd known him, Robert looked small, older, tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. I built this company from nothing, he said quietly, and I let it slip out of my hands. I didn't interrupt. I thought loyalty meant trusting family, he continued. I didn't realize I was confusing loyalty with blindness. He slid a folder across the desk toward me. Inside were documents I already expected. Internal reviews, financial audits, board correspondence, my data, my timelines, my projections, now official. They'll want explanations, he said. The board, investors, partners. And scapegoats, I added calmly. He nodded. I won't allow that, he said. Not again. The word again lingered between us. What happens to Jason? I asked. Robert exhaled slowly. "He's done," he said. Effective immediately. No anger, no satisfaction, just finality. The next morning, the office felt different before anyone even said a word. Rumors moved faster than emails. People whispered near the coffee machine. Managers avoided eye contact. Everyone sensed a shift in gravity. Jason arrived late. He walked straight toward his office and stopped. Two people from HR stood there. A box on the desk behind them. For a moment, he didn't understand. Then he laughed. "This is a joke," he said loudly. "My father asked you to collect your personal belongings," one of them said evenly. The laughter faded. He looked around, searching for allies, for eyes that would meet his, for someone to say this wasn't real. No one did. When his gaze landed on me, it burned. "You think you won?" he spat. I stood up slowly. "I think actions have consequences," I replied. He shook his head, voice rising. "You were nothing without this company." I held his gaze. "No," I said. "You were nothing without someone cleaning up after you." That was the moment he lost control. He shouted, accused, claimed betrayal, nepotism in reverse. He demanded meetings, threatened lawsuits, promised this wasn't over. Facts didn't argue back. Security arrived quietly, professionally. Jason left with a box under his arm and no one clapping behind him, no one filming, no one whispering admiration. Just the soft click of the elevator doors closing. Robert didn't come in that day. Instead, an internal memo went out by noon. Leadership restructuring, immediate changes. His name wasn't on it. Neither was Jason's. By the end of the week, both were gone. No farewell email, no speech, no framed photo removed with ceremony. Their offices were emptied by people who had nothing to say about it. I watched from my desk as the nameplates disappeared. I felt no joy, only something quieter, cleaner, like pressure releasing from a system that had been running too long under strain. Later that afternoon, a junior analyst approached me hesitantly. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said, "for not letting it be us." I nodded. That was enough. Power doesn't always announce itself when it changes hands. Sometimes it simply moves. From noise to competence, from entitlement to accountability. Jason and Robert Miller didn't walk out defeated by anger or revenge. They left because there was nothing left to protect them. And for the first time since I joined the company, the silence in the office didn't feel humiliating. It felt earned. The office didn't celebrate. There were no congratulations, no speeches, no sudden warmth. Power rarely arrives with applause. It settles in quietly, testing whether it's real. On Monday morning, I walked into the same building, through the same glass doors, past the same security desk. The carpet still had that faint coffee stain near the elevators. The printer still jammed. Nothing looked different. Everything was. People looked up when I passed. Not out of curiosity, out of attention. Meetings changed first. Jason used to dominate the room before anyone sat down. Now the rooms filled slowly, carefully. People waited. When discussions began, no one talked over anyone else. And when I spoke, no one interrupted. Not once. At first, it felt unsettling. I wasn't used to finishing sentences without someone cutting in, correcting me, or dismissing my point as too detailed. I caught myself pausing unnecessarily, as if expecting resistance. It never came. Instead, people nodded, took notes, asked questions, real ones. "Emily, what do the numbers actually say? Emily, what's the risk here? Emily, would you sign off on this?" I answered calmly, precisely, without softening my voice or apologizing for certainty. And something strange happened. I was no longer careful with my words. I didn't dilute conclusions to sound pleasant. I didn't preface statements with maybe or just a thought. I spoke as someone whose time mattered, because now it did. The company began to stabilize. Not dramatically, no overnight miracles, just steady correction. Bad contracts renegotiated, unrealistic projects paused, budgets rebuilt on reality instead of optimism. People worked harder, not out of fear, but out of clarity. One afternoon, I noticed something small. Someone laughed at a joke I made in a meeting. Not politely, not nervously, genuinely. I almost didn't recognize the sound. Not everyone was comfortable with the change. Some people avoided me now, the same way they once avoided Jason. Authority always creates distance. Others tested boundaries, cautiously, subtly, expecting me to assert dominance the way he had. I didn't. I listened. And when someone tried to take credit for work that wasn't theirs, I didn't confront them emotionally. I corrected the record. Publicly. Calmly. Once. It never happened again. Sometimes, late in the evening, I caught my reflection in the dark glass of the conference room walls. The same clothes. The same posture. But something in my eyes had changed. I no longer waited for permission to exist. The memory of that sentence, about trash, about food, about cutting my salary, still surfaced sometimes. Not painfully, sharply. Like a scar that reminds you where not to be careless again. Jason's name stopped coming up. Robert's, too. People move on quickly when stability replaces chaos. The company didn't need villains anymore. It needed structure, predictability, trust. One day, a new hire sat beside me during lunch. "I was told you're intimidating," she said carefully. I smiled. "Am I?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No. Just very clear." Clear. I liked that word. Clarity had cost me silence, patience, and time, but it had given me something far more valuable in return. Respect that didn't need volume. For years, I had been the quiet girl in the corner, the one people spoke over, the one they underestimated because she didn't fight for attention. Now, no one mistook my calm for weakness. And the most satisfying part? I didn't need to prove anything anymore. They already knew. I was the woman no one interrupts. And I had only one chapter left to write. Not for them, but for myself. I thought the end would feel louder. I thought there would be a moment. A clear finish line where everything that happened would finally make sense, where I would feel victorious, transformed, complete. Instead, rebirth felt quiet, almost ordinary. One evening, months later, I stayed late again. Not because the company was drowning this time, but because I wanted to finish a report properly. The office was calm, stable, the kind of calm that comes not from denial, but from control. I shut down my computer and remained seated for a moment, listening. No raised voices, no tension hiding in silence, no fear of what tomorrow's numbers would reveal. I realized then that I hadn't thought about Jason in weeks. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. Not at all. That surprised me more than anything else. Power, I learned, isn't about replacing someone who hurt you. It's about becoming someone who no longer revolves around them. I packed my bag and stood up, catching my reflection in the dark screen of my monitor. The woman looking back at me wasn't dramatic. She didn't look triumphant. She looked solid, grounded. I remembered the version of myself who looked down at the printer, holding warm reports while an entire office went silent. The woman who absorbed humiliation because she believed survival required quiet endurance. She wasn't weak. She was unfinished. Back then, I thought strength meant responding, defending, proving, fighting loudly enough to be heard. I was wrong. Strength was knowing when to wait, when to watch, when to gather truth patiently while others mistook silence for surrender. That sentence about trash and food didn't break me. It stripped me. It removed the last illusion I had, that dignity would be granted to me if I worked hard enough, stayed loyal enough, endured long enough. Dignity isn't granted. It's taken the moment you stop accepting humiliation as the price of belonging. The company continued to grow, slowly and honestly. No exaggerated promises, no reckless expansion, just decisions that could survive scrutiny. People trusted the process because they understood it now. Sometimes new employees asked about the past. Was it really that bad? What changed everything? I never told the story in full. I just said, we started listening to the numbers. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was this. I stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. I stopped translating my competence into palatable fragments. I stopped apologizing for clarity. And when I did, the world adjusted. Not instantly, not kindly, but inevitably. One morning, as I walked into the office, I noticed something small taped near the coffee machine, a printed quote someone had put up anonymously. Sometimes, to grow, you need to be deeply underestimated. I stood there longer than necessary, coffee growing cold in my hand. They didn't know it was about me. And that was perfect. Rebirth doesn't announce itself. It doesn't erase the past or rewrite it into something prettier. It integrates it, uses it, builds on it. I didn't forget that sentence. I didn't forgive it either. I carried it forward, not as a wound, but as a reminder of how far silence can go when it finally decides to speak.